If you want to be a pro mixer, you should probably do the things that pro mixers do. I've identified 13 of those things from my own experience and just from things I've heard other pros say over the years, and these are things that most amateur mixers do not do. And the first one is to stay organized. You know what they say, if your house is messy, if your room is messy, it's a reflection of the state of your life or of the state of your mind. Well, that might not be like 100% accurate, but I think there is a lot of truth to that. Everything from your schedule to the workspace around you to the files on your hard drive to the session itself. Like, do you name the tracks the same way every time? Do you put them in the same order on the screen? Do you mark out the different sections of the song or group tracks by color coding? All of these little things help you work a lot faster, and they keep you from wasting time when you're just like deciphering your own mess instead of actually being creative. And if you stay organized, then you can do habit number 2, which is to use a template. Now, if you think of someone like Chris Lord-Alge who's mixing on a console, they're gonna have those tracks in the same order, in the same spot on the console every time. The same instruments on the same faders with the same inserts and effects patched in, ready to go. For example, the lead vocal, I guarantee you on that channel on the console, he's already got the insert of the 1176 there set the way he wants it. Even the EQ knobs on the console, they're probably already set to the ballpark frequencies that he would normally reach for on that particular instrument. And when it comes to reverbs and delay sense, it's already patched in and set up. It's just a matter of turning a knob to get that effect. You can do the exact same thing in your DAW. Just create a session with your typical processing chains on all the tracks, have your routing and track groups and effect sends and returns and everything all set up and ready to go, and use this as a starting point for every mix. It could save you literally hours every day, and plus it keeps you a lot more creative because you're not wasting your time on repetitive low value actions. And if you don't do this, then you're putting a severe handicap on how many songs you can mix in a day or a week, plus you will never be able to bring on an assistant to start to outsource a lot of that mix prep work. All right, pro mixer habit number 3 is to know your speakers and know your room. Now, most people obsess over what monitors they have and what their room is like, but what trumps this every time is whether you know what music should sound like on your monitors in your room. And the way to do this is to listen to a lot of music in your space. So pick 5 records that you know really well and love the way they sound, and just play them continuously in your studio while you're not actively recording and mixing. And you've also got to know what those records sound like outside of your studio. So, you know, those records, those bands that you've been listening to in your car for the last 5 years, those are perfect records to bring into your studio and listen to repetitively on your monitors, so that it just gets ingrained in you and it almost becomes an instinct of what a pro record should sound like in your space. And be very slow to change the monitors you're using, because you have to start from scratch and relearn them every time. Unless you're switching into NS10s, in which case you should probably just go and get those and never have to worry about monitors again. All right, speaking of monitors, the next habit is to monitor quietly. You've probably heard this tip before, but there's a lot of confusion around it. Like, well, how quiet is quiet enough? Personally, I spend most of my time mixing around 70 to 75 dB on average, as measured by this iPhone app anyway. It's just on the edge of where you could still have a conversation with someone beside you without raising your voice. Now, the whole point of this listen quietly thing is that you don't want to get fooled by your speakers. You know, if you have them really loud and they're just pumping, everything's going to sound big and exciting. But instead, you want to get it sounding exciting even at low volumes and make sure you can still hear everything without having to crank up the speakers. Plus, the quieter you listen, the less your room acoustics are going to come into play, which is a nice bonus too. Number 5 is to separate your mixing from editing and production. This is absolutely huge for a lot of amateurs, especially if they're working on their own music with MIDI drums and amp sims. A lot of people are still writing parts and changing out guitar tones and drum sounds while they're trying to mix. And that just means you'll never actually finish your mix. You'll just keep restarting and going around and around in circles. When it's time to mix, you just need to mix. Take care of all that stuff beforehand. Make those decisions before it's mix time. And yes, I know there's rare exceptions where you need to change something at the last minute, but that should not happen very often. And if you're separating those phases properly, that means you'll also have to make a habit of bouncing down drum samples and virtual instruments. Now, I never want to see a virtual instrument playing in real time in my mix session. Why? Well, number 1, it's really bad for recall. I mean, what if I need to recall a song 5 years from now and all of a sudden I don't have that virtual instrument anymore, or the plugin's not supported by my operating system? You need to make sure you get that stuff down to an audio file so that you don't have to worry about recall even 10 years from now. But secondly, it forces you to commit to sounds. Like, pick a drum sample, commit to it, print it down, get rid of the trigger track, and then move on. And same thing with guitar tones these days with plugins. A lot of people don't have the confidence to do this. They second guess themselves a lot, but just think about it. Your instinct of the first like 3 minutes you're hearing the song and the guitar tone and the drum sounds, those first minutes you're probably gonna have a way better gut feeling and instinct of what sound works best. Then you're gonna have, 4 hours into the mix where you're spiraling out of control in your mind and doubting everything that you've done. It actually helps your mix to let your decisions compound on top of each other and not constantly restart and redo things and lose all of your momentum. Habit number 7 is to follow the same workflow every time. Now, I know we're talking a lot about workflow stuff here, and there's an important reason I'll tell you in a little bit, and I'm also gonna be getting to the last 5 habits, which are a lot more technical. I'm getting there. Now, if you were building a house, you would have to pour the foundation first, then put up the frame, and then the walls. There's a logical process to follow, and if you don't have that process, you're gonna feel really uncertain and scattered. It's about staying in the creative flow. Don't do one mix where you start with getting the drums right first, and then the next time you mix, all of a sudden you decide you're gonna start with the vocals first instead. Well, for me, there are 7 specific steps I follow when I mix. I do it the same every time, and this is what helps me stay mixing fast, consistent, and I know when my mix is done. Speaking of that, the next habit, number 8, is huge. Set a deadline. I often get asked, how do you actually know when your mix is done? Sometimes the answer is really simple. It's like, there's a deadline, I ran out of time, it's done. The thing to grasp here is that done is better than perfect. Like, you're better off finishing 50 mixes in a year that you're not totally happy with than doing 12 mixes in a year and spending a month on each one. The person doing 50 is gonna get way better, way faster than the person doing 12, just out of sheer repetition and experience. So don't get stuck. Set a deadline, stick to it, and keep moving forward. Habit number 9 is to use reference tracks sparingly. Now, using reference tracks is super crucial when you're mixing, but there is a danger. You can easily reference too much and end up going down a rabbit hole, and then instead of trying to maximize the tracks that you've got in front of you, you end up just trying to morph and mangle them into sounding like something else. So reference just briefly, just a minute or two before you start mixing, somewhere in the middle of the mix, and towards the end. And the purpose is not to try and copy some other mix, it's just to make sure your ears are tuned to what a pro mix should sound like and get a sense of where the ballpark is. What's the overall amount of low end, mid-range, and high ends that you're shooting for. All right, habit 10, I love this one. Push things to find the sweet spot. Unfortunately, because of some bad advice on Facebook groups or YouTube videos, people are really afraid to push things in their mixes. They won't boost an EQ more than a few dB, or they won't compress something more than a couple dB because they're afraid something's gonna go wrong and they're gonna ruin it. But if you never push things far enough or even too far, then you'll probably never find the sweet spot. Even something simple like setting your levels, for example, a bass guitar. Well, keep pushing that fader up until it's obviously too loud, and then bring it back down. It'll be much easier to find where that sweet spot is. But if you never push that fader up to begin with, then it's gonna be too low. Same goes for EQ and compression. Keep pushing it, find where that limit is and where it goes over the limit, and then bring it back and trust your ears. Literally nothing bad is going to happen. All you need to do is just turn it back down. So you don't need to be so scared. Aside from just being afraid to push things, the other reason you might not push it far enough is because you're mixing in solo too much, and that is habit number 11, avoiding solo as much as possible. You simply cannot make the right decision about a mix if you're doing it in solo. If this were cooking, it would be like trying to decide how much garlic the dish needs by just tasting the garlic by itself. No one else is gonna hear that instrument in solo. Just you, no one else. And this is a really, really hard habit to break, but you have to try and break it. And once you do, you're gonna find out that 80% of the moves you were making in your mixes were basically inaudible or made no difference at all. And that's probably the #1 reason why most people's mixes sound dull and boring. And you should try to reverse this habit so much that you feel more uncomfortable making a move in solo than in the context of the whole mix. All right, the second last pro mixing habit is to focus on the mid-range above all else. Amateur mixes have a big low end and a nice shiny bright top end and a super weak mid-range. Now go and listen to a big sample of pro mixes and pro records. You're gonna find that the amount of low end, like the sub rumble, and the amount of brightness in the top end, it varies a ton from mix to mix. And this is a hard habit to form too, because those low frequencies that you feel in your chest or those high airy frequencies, they're just so pleasing to the ear. But they also don't really matter if you don't get the mid-range right. This is a really important topic. There's a lot more to say about it, so I'll link to a video I have about nailing the mid-range in the description below. All right, we've made it to the last habit of pro mixers, and that is to automate for excitement. By far, automation is my favorite part of mixing. Actually, I would say that my mix is only about 80% done before I start automating. And I automate everything: kick, the snare, drum fills, overheads, bass and guitar level, vocals, of course. This is where the mix comes to life. It's where you bring the listener on a journey and you're giving them different things to focus on at different times and bringing certain elements forward and then bringing them back. And it's not just volume levels either. I'm often automating effects sends and returns, EQs, sometimes even compression as a song evolves. A lot of amateur mixers don't do this because they're either too lazy, they think it's going to be a lot of work, or they just don't understand the impact that it's going to have on their mixes. But I guarantee you, all of your favorite pro mixers are automating a lot, so don't skip it. So notice how more than half of these pro habits I told you about were not about EQ tips or compression or plugins. They were about consistency and workflow and environment. And you'll find this in every craft out there, every sport. The great ones become great, not just because of talent and skill alone, but because of the habits they form that mean they never skip the basics. To put it in perspective, an amateur might watch 20 videos about a new plugin, while a pro mixer is streamlining their template. I recommend that you go deeper in learning these habits, especially about nailing the mid-range and using automation to get loud and exciting mixes. And I've got videos on each of those things here. Go ahead, check them out.